How are you today? I'm sunburned. And it wasn't golf. It was the block party at the Summit Church. And it was glorious. I saw more young families excited and having the greatest time imaginable. Let me ask you, here's a quick question, kind of prepare you. What was the number one attraction at the block party for young boys? Axe throwing, yes! They went crazy over that. It was so cool. They felt so manly to go in the cage and throw axes. Now that's just the build-up because it leads to the crucial question, what is the number one favorite story in the Bible, in the Old Testament, for young boys? David and Goliath. You got to ask why, because when you're a child, the story is taught as one of the greatest underdog accounts imaginable, because they always portray David and Goliath like this. And every young boy sees himself as this scrawny, weakling kid, and Goliath as the worst bully in the school. In case you're wondering, that's John Schoberg. That was his name. No idea where he is today. But in elementary school, he was a Goliath in the worst way. It's a great story, isn't it? But I got to tell you, it's all wrong. It's all wrong because even though it became a metaphor, David and Goliath, I mean, you hear it all the time in terms of political contests or sports events. David and Goliath is the metaphor for the underdog coming from behind and winning big, and it's wrong. Because here's the truth. Goliath never stood a chance. And that's the Bible for adults. And I want to take you there today because it's just an incredible story. I want you to sit back, and if you've heard this story once, twice, 10, 100 times before, I want you to just disengage for a moment so that you can lean in and listen anew and hear this story straight from Scripture. And imagine it in your mind, focusing on David and who he was and what he did. And why Goliath was a lost cause from the very beginning. Here it is. The text comes to us from 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its rod point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Now, this is straight from Scriptures, and what is being described is a giant that stood more than 7 feet tall in an age where most men were 5'2". He was a giant. He was mammoth. And historians have speculated as to why he was such a giant in the age and what medical maladies may have caused it. All that is irrelevant, really, to the story and highly speculative. Simple truth is he was a fighting man, and he was ready for battle, and he was looking for Israel to name a champion. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of the Israelites, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. It wasn't David who was afraid. It was the forces of Saul, the Israelites. Early in the morning, David left the flock. He was caring for the flock while his brothers went off to war. His father sent him with supplies. David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse, his father, had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. David went to the king. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servants will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from the time of his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin? But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." I don't even have to read the end of the story, do I? Besides, it's a little violent, a little R-rated. So let me just distill it down, paraphrased by Preissig. David skipped out onto the field of battle. He took his sling. He was a slinger, which was actually part of the army of the day. He took his sling and fired a smooth stone, and it struck Goliath, and he fell. And then David finished him off, Rambo style. Are you with me? Do I have to add any more? And you read the story, and it's still, thousands of years later, it resonates with such verve and vitality, such passion and faith. But you got to stop and step away and say, okay, we're no longer in Sunday school. What does it mean for adults? This story of David and Goliath. Let me unpack it for you and show you the relevance that actually speaks not just to children, but especially to adults. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with David. David was prepared. Now, every little boy pictures himself as David as a little boy, and we think of him as being scrawny and meek and mild, and it is so far from the truth. David actually gave us his resume. You heard it before. When a lion or bear comes and carries off a sheep from the flock, I go after it and attack it and rescue the victim by its jaws. Then if it turns on me, I seize it, this is a different translation, by the beard and batter it to death. Isn't that good? Gives you a very image of David. Now, I don't know how observant you are of military forces, but my son was a Marine. Some of you were Marines. Some of you were in the service. Thank God for your service with honor and distinction. Going to his various events when he graduated from boot camp and at other times and seeing him go off to Afghanistan and then come back, I observed that Marines come in two sizes. You probably never thought about this, or not exactly this way, but Marines come in two sizes. There's the Rottweiler, okay? Isn't it true? And then there's the Doberman. And which one do you have to be afraid of? Both. But it's the Doberman that will surprise you because they look skinny and harmless, don't they? Isn't that true? They look skinny and harmless like David. But David was prepared because he had faced the challenges, the giants of every age as he matured and grew in his faith and trust in God. What about you? Well, let me just point out what is painfully obvious. And you won't like it, but I'm just the messenger. This doesn't come from me. This really comes straight from Scripture. God has very little investment in your comfort. We think God exists to keep us comfortable and life easy. And when life isn't easy, when it becomes challenging and difficult, that's when we complain to God and we say, God, how could you let this happen to me? Assuming that we ought to be exempted from those challenges, those difficult moments, never stopping to think how God might use the circumstances of our lives, not cause them, use the circumstances of our life in such a way so as not to keep us complacent and comfortable, but to grow us into courageous Christians that can face ever greater challenges in life. It's rather like the entire education process. You start out in kindergarten, right? And they start you out with counting, which is a useful skill and it comes fairly easily. And then while you're in elementary school, they teach you addition and subtraction and groups. Remember how easy all of that was? And then quickly they skip on as you mature to multiplication. And at least then you had to memorize your multiplication tables, and they actually tested you on it. And that was all to prepare you for what was really going to be confounding division. Remember those days? And that was nothing to what you were taught in junior high, high school, and college. Do you notice the progression? It becomes ever more challenging and difficult. Because if you had arrested the development when you were in elementary school, you wouldn't even be able to do the math necessary to balance your checkbook, let alone do what you must do so often in life or your job. Because it's only in the difficult, challenging circumstances of life we grow. And our impulse is always to stop it, to back up and say, no, let's run back to Egypt and slavery because at least it was comfortable and we knew what to expect, rather than daring to step out in faith and allow God to stretch us and grow us to be all that He intends. Rick Warren, in one of his books, said it this way. He said, the education process in terms of maturity and faith, every storm is a school, he said. Every trial is a teacher. Every experience is an education. Every difficulty is an opportunity for development. And it stinks. And it's so true. And I must confess, there have been so many times that I have fallen to my knees and asked God why I was enduring that particular time of trouble. But I've got to tell you, all the time, spanning all the years of ministry, prepared me for the challenges of life that continue to come and grew my faith. David faced down Goliath without fear. And Goliath never had a chance because David was prepared. And he played to his strengths. I didn't read you the story, the element of the story, but David went to Saul to accept Goliath's challenge. And Saul wanted to put his own armor on David. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but men, as they age, their physique is not exactly the same when they're 60 as it was when they're 20. Have you noticed that? Have you made that observation? It's absolutely true. And when I think of Saul, I kind of see a Henry VIII physique. Are you following me? And I imagine the armor that would have been crafted for Saul put upon David, and the absurdity of it becomes so obvious. Because if David was to face down the giant that threatened Israel, it meant that he played to his own strengths, not anyone else's. And we routinely get that wrong because we think the way to success is following the path that someone else followed. Goliath had this huge spear with the heavy point. And what did David have? 5 smooth stones. Malcolm Gladwell actually wrote a book about this. David and Goliath is the title. And it's a great book. And he talks about the Israeli Defense Forces doing testing on the velocity of a sling. All right? And just so you see it, the sling had leather thongs that went down to a leather pocket that held the stone, and you would separate the thongs in your fingers and you would spin it like this. And this was actually a position in the army of Israel. They were called slingers, and they would wind up and they would fire the sling. And according to the Israeli Defense Forces, the velocity of a smooth stone would match that of a .45 caliber pistol at close range. I mean, Goliath didn't stand a chance. And neither will the giants in your life if you dare to play to the extraordinary strengths that God has given you. I still remember in my preaching class in divinity school, Bill Meal, who was the professor, stood before us and pointed out the obvious. He said, "None of you are going to be Billy Graham." He was right. And he said, and it would be a horrible mistake to try to be him and not you. Did you catch that? We live in an imitative age where we wear the clothes that someone else is wearing because we think they're popular and we'll be popular. We wear the aftershave or we drink the beer or whatever it is. We want to imitate people that we see as being popular, desirable, effective, successful. It's why How to Dress for Success kind of books never go out of style. And yet here's what I know to be true. After 21 years with you, God made you beautifully. And he made you on purpose, not by accident. And he entrusted to you gifts and graces that no one else has. And when you play to those strengths, it changes everything. David did exactly that. But not only did he play to his strengths, he dared. He dared to trust entirely to God. Remember last week I talked about the Special Air Services, the British Special Air Services, and their motto. Do you remember their motto? Who dares wins. Remember? Who dares wins. And it's true not just for them. I believe it's intended to be true for us. And it's not the reality. Because the thing is, we tend to be limited to what we perceive are our own limitations in ability. People say to me all the time, they say, do you believe in positive thinking? And the answer is yes, of course. What's the alternative? Negative thinking? I believe in positive thinking, absolutely. I actually knew Norman Vincent Peale. I went to some of his seminars at his home, and it was really cool. But there are limitations. There are limitations to positive thinking. because positive thinking will only carry you to the extent of your ability. And beyond that, it's just wishful thinking. What we need is faith, not in ourselves and our own ability, but God. Because the simple truth is, when we actually take a stand and dare to take a step in faith, we're already accomplishing more than most Christians and churches. Here's the hard reality. Most Christians and churches today operate as functional atheists. They profess faith in God, and yet they live as if they are completely constrained by their own abilities, and they never dare to step out. They never actually ever put God to the test and take a risk that will require God's help. And that's when greatness is revealed, and that's what we saw in the field of battle then and now. We see the battle, God sees the victory, because He knows He's with us. And when we dare to step out and take on the giants that are arrayed against us, whatever it is in your life, and I won't even dare to name examples, because I may not name yours. But you will, you can, when you think of the giants that you confront at home, at school, at work, in life. Here's what you need to know. You're never alone. That God is with you. That God strengthens you. And the reason Goliath didn't have a chance is because God was with David. Years ago, I heard a preacher. He was an older man then, so he's gone to God long ago. But he was just such a delightful soul. He was a storyteller. He was charming. He was loving. And I was touched by his ministry. He grew up in Tornado Alley. Anybody know Tornado Alley? Anybody grow up in Tornado Alley? Yeah, it's a dangerous place to be. He grew up on a farm, and it was his father and mother and his siblings, and they lived in a house that didn't have a basement. It had a root cellar. Anybody remember dirt floor root cellars? Storm was blowing in, and they were expecting the tornado. And the preacher, now grown tall and old, was a little boy. And his parents gathered he and his siblings all together. They took them down to the root cellar, and the mother laid down on a blanket on the dirt floor and gathered her children in close to her, and then the dad put a heavy mattress over all of them. And then the dad slipped out to watch for the storm. They heard the winds blowing, and this little boy wriggled away from his mother, squirted out from underneath the mattress, ran up those few steps, and went out into the storm. And he said why. He described why. He said he realized that he was far safer clinging to his father than anywhere else. And you realize, of course, he wasn't talking just about that tornado. He was talking about life. Your life. I don't know what giants you face. But my prayer is that you will take all the experiences of life and allow it to create an education in faith. That you realize that God has not only exposed you to experiences, but equipped you with unique gifts and graces. And God has called you for this moment, not to stand alone, to stand with Him. Because imagine the giants you will face down, standing fast in faith with God.